Good morning. I'm just going to continue with my series on the Pearl Springs tournament in 2009. I'm just concentrating on the games which were won. I'm not including the draws. So here, Magnus Carlsen plays with the black pieces against Dmitry Yakovenko, a reasonably strong Russian grandmaster. And we get a Najdorf. So e4, c5 from Magnus, knight f3 from Yakovenko, and e6, d6 even, to support the c5 pawns, allow the bishop out into the game, and to, just generally get things started on the queen side. The pawn is pushed, and it's taken by the knight. The open variation of the Sicilian, and Magnus plays knight to f6, not to c6. But after he plays knight to c6, Magnus plays a6, and now it's a Najdorf variation, an open. Slightly different from the Kalashnikov, that you exclude the knight from this square before playing the knight to c6. The bishop develops. This is a quiet development, and it's known as the Opochensky variation. But it's a reasonable place for the white bishop, and it will take time for black to get a firm foothold in the game. He starts by chasing away the knight, which is already denied this square and this square, so we'll just have this square or this square to go to. Goes to b3, which is the normal move. Bishop comes to b7, and both sides castle. Bishop comes to e3. Now we can see that Magnus can play his bishop, and then he's two moves back in getting finished with his development. He needs to move his bishop, move his knight, move his queen. Yakovenko just needs to move his queen. But he's got a really solid setup in return for that small disadvantage in development. But it's got to be said that it's not as big as it could have been, because this knight here has moved 1, 2, 3 times. And Magnus has just moved these pieces 1 time each, so that makes up for the fact that he's done 1, 2, 3, and the pawn here 4 pawn moves against Yakovenko's 1, 2 pawn moves. So 2 extra pawn moves, but an extra move for the knight, so he's just 1 move behind really. So the bishop comes out, and as I said, queen here, knight here, queen here, and development's finished for both. So he's just one move behind, and has a very solid position for his troubles. And the queen develops. Maybe he might be looking at playing bishop here. The knight comes out. There are obviously some developmental issues for black in this position. He can't really play queen to c7, because the knight just comes and attacks it straight away. But he might prefer to, support with the bishop first, or whatever. It just, it isn't the most obvious, simple, straightforward development for black. But he plays his knight to b6. He's looking at getting into this square and forking the queen and bishop to get rid of the bishop pair. The pawn comes forward. Very good pawn here. It now holds these two. A real endgame asset for Yakovenko. And the knight comes to c4, guaranteeing that he will now be having the 2 bishops, because he can't move that bishop or he loses the queen. If he moves the queen, he loses the bishop, and if he takes the bishop here, he loses the bishop. So with knight c4, Magnus guarantees himself the 2 bishops. But it turns out to be a bishop pair that is hard to hold on to. The bishop captures with a tempo, because it's threatening the rook on f1 and the chance to win an exchange. And now Carlsen might be in more of a position to consider playing queen to c7. But instead he plays rook to c8 to get his rook on a better developed square. Yakovenko can now play bishop to d6, b6 even, and threaten the queen, and the queen then has to come to d7. But that's probably what he would want to do anyway, and now that there isn't anything else on this file, it probably isn't such a big advantage. It would be nice to get a knight into b6, but the rook probably not such a big deal. But he supports the pawn, so that he can then think about moving knight here, and then knight here, and then knight here. If he just moves knight straight away, of course the pawn on e4 falls and he gets an attack on the queen. So the rook comes to c6. This is really good. This is part of a really long-term plan to get his pieces active and well coordinated, which we can imagine Carlsen is going to succeed with. The king just goes for a little bit more safety, out into the corner, can't argue with that, and the queen comes to c8. So that, yeah. So that, for example, if he plays knight to a4, then Carlsen has the option of taking here with the bishop and then playing rook here, threaten the queen, and maybe get a bit better development. So the rook comes to c1 also to protect the c2 pawn if this knight ever moves. The rook comes to d8 because the queen and rook are there, and his backward pawn on d6 will need defending for a good long time. This is the disadvantage of some Sicilian systems, is that you get a backward pawn on d6, but with the bishop already here, the rook in action, and the rook here, you know, it's often the case that it isn't so difficult to defend that backwards pawn as it is, for example, in a Benoni. The knight comes to d5, which I think is probably a mistake, because it means that now Yakovenko, when the knight is taken, which of course it needs to be, you can't let such a strong knight be there, and besides the bishop is threatened, and yeah, that would be a full family fork. You just can't let it be there. But when it's taken, Yakovenko isn't in a position to take back with a piece, which means that the pawn takes, and this makes his pawn structure weaker and gives Magnus more freedom to develop his piece. Say he takes with the bishop, and it's taken with the pawn. He takes with the bishop and not with the knight, because if he took with the knight, then the rook would be threatened by this move, and the only place it would have to go would be c7, and then the bishop would come to b6 and skewer the two rooks. So he had to take with the bishop so that he had a place to move his rook to, and then that's how his bishop pair disappeared. So they're now both playing with just a dark squared bishop. But Magnus gets his rook to c4. Yeah, great. Maybe he might be looking at finding a way to get the rook to d4. At the moment it's covered by several pieces, so it doesn't look so useful. Maybe he might be looking at getting his rook to h4 to begin a kingside attack. Maybe, you know, his rook is more active there. So the queen comes to d3, and I think this is another small error from Yakovenko, which Magnus pounces on immediately. The problem with playing queen to c3, probably in order to be able to move this pawn, you know, is that it means that this pawn now, when it's moved, threatens the queen and the pawn, and so has to be taken. And the rook is now beautifully centralised. And yeah, I think Magnus can look forward to doubling the rooks on the e-file at some point. And the pawn comes to c4. Yeah, of course, he has to try and make some progress on the queen side. The rooks double, and the bishop retreats out of the way, and the bishop comes to f8, and suddenly the doubled rooks on the e file look great. The knight comes to e5. Maybe he's threatening to come here and threaten the pawn. Can't at the minute because the queen's covering it, but you know, it's a more centralized, more progressive square. The pawn comes to g6. To keep the knight out of here permanently, you know, if, for example, Yakovenko thought of playing rook here and then knight here, this pawn keeps out permanently, but at the same time allows the bishop to fianchetto. And the bishop doesn't fianchetto to defend the knight, it attacks the rook instead. So there are a bunch of complicated tactical opportunities here, which both navigate fairly well. So the rook comes to f4 to threaten the rook, and also the rook behind is still threatened by the bishop. So the queen comes to d3 to support the rook on f1. Excuse me. The knight comes forward to g4. Yeah, I might be in a position to play knight e2 check, knight f2 check, and when he takes with the bishop, Carlsen can take the bishop with the rook, and then when the rook takes, he can take the rook on c1 with his bishop. So he's threatening tactics here. The knight comes partly to block the attack on the rook, but partly to cover the square e1 where he's threatening to double up his rooks. Indeed, he doubles his rooks again and creates a renewed threat of playing rook to e1. It's covered by the knight at the minute. The rook comes to c3, to some extent weakening his back rank, but you know. So the knight comes to e3 and threatens the rook. Obviously, if the bishop takes, the rook is going to take, and then he's going to be threatening the queen and the rook behind it. So he plays the rook to get out of the way of the attack by the knight, but also to take some grip on the e file where Magnus has his united pawns. So Magnus develops his queen to a more active square, and now he's also threatening possibly to win this pawn. Possibly. It might not quite work at the minute, but you know, it's a threat. So rook comes to, oh yeah, of course, and he was also threatening mate on g2. The rook comes to e2 to defend against the mate on g2. The queen comes to h5. Is he threatening to come here? Is he threatening to double the rooks? Well, you know, what is going on? Not quite sure, but it's a nice active square for the queen. So it's taken off, and the rook takes, and the rook takes, and the bishop takes. And if we just stop a minute and assess the situation, and I'll say what I think. But before I say what I think, work out what you think. Put the video on pause if you need to, and work out what you think the evaluation from the computer will be. Yeah, I think it's a relatively unbalanced position. Carlsen has the bishop against the knight. If it comes to a pure bishop against knight endgame, that will be advantage to Magnus. Why? Because there's pawns on both sides of the board, and with pawns on both sides of the board, the knight will struggle to stop pawns from advancing on both sides. The bishop can easily stop pawns from advancing on both sides, either from the centre or from more long-range squares. Yakovenko has a large queenside majority, 4 against 3, 3 against 2 on the king side for Carlsen, but how mobile is that majority? And Yakovenko has some back rank issues. So I'm going to, it's fairly even, but I'm going to guess it's about minus 0.7. Nearly a pawn advantage to Carlsen is my guess. But instead, it's more than one pawn advantage to Yakovenko, and it said he should have taken with the rook, not with the bishop. So, what do I know? If you done better than me, put it in the comment. Show how smart you are compared to me. Great. Okay, we'll continue. The queen comes to e2, and the bishop is now pinned because the rook could be taken by the queen afterwards. The queen comes to h6 to defend the bishop, which is pinned and attacked by the rook and the queen. So to defend it another time. The pawn comes forward and is taken, and he pushes the pawn, the d pawn, looking to get a new queen. The rook comes to c3, so that the bishop is free to move because the rook is defended on by the pawn on f7. Look at the ideal position of the bishop and how many of the squares that the knight can go to are controlled. This is controlled by the knight and the bishop. This is controlled by the bishop and the queen. This is controlled by the queen. This is controlled by the bishop. This is free, and this is controlled by the bishop. So, and the queen. So not much freedom of movement for that knight here. And the pawn advances to d7, almost ready to queen. But the bishop comes to g5 to cover the square and threaten the queen at the same time. Is it possible to sacrifice the queen by taking the knight, bishop, and then promoting? No, because when he takes the knight, Carlsen will takes with the knight, Carlsen will take with the bishop and still cover the square and still be threatening the queen. So it doesn't work. So he plays his queen to d1, partly to get out of the way of the attack by the bishop, and partly to try and enforce the move pawn to d8 queen. So the bishop comes to d8, where it can threaten this pawn, and yeah, it looks maybe like it's a bit out of the way, but actually it's a very good square for the bishop, and it still controls a number of the knight's forward moves. So the pawn is taken, of course, and the queen attacks the rook at the same time and defends the bishop. So the rook defends the d pawn so that the queen can maybe think about rerouting to c8. The queen comes to b4, threatening the pawn on b2, and also threatening rook or queen to e1 check if the knight moves or the queen moves. So the pawn moves, and the rook doubles up an attack on it, and he's threatening now rook takes pawn and then rook here to pin the queen to the king. So the knight has to defend the pawn, and the queen comes to attack the pawn once more and to put more pressure on the knight as well. The knight comes to f3, queen comes back to b4, the knight comes to d2 again. Are we going to get a repetition? Magnus does not want to draw. He plays queen to f4, and he's still got threats on various things. And yeah, if the knight moves, it's most likely that the queen here is going to drop. The pawn here is going to drop. Say the knight moves here, then the pawn here can be taken, and if the queen takes, then mate will follow on f1. So of course he plays the knight to f3, where it covers the e1 square and blocks the queen from access to the f1 square. But now the rook comes to c1, c3, so that he's threatening c1, pinning the queen again. And the queen comes out of the way, and Magnus proposes a queen trade, which Yakovenko has to agree to, and the rook retreats, and now the king comes to f8 so that he's ready to come to f7 so that he can then take this pawn on a5. So that check puts his knight in a very bad position, and Magnus gets his pawn back by taking the pawn on a5. Obviously he still can't queen because he can take it with the rook or the bishop. This is to give his king an escape square, and the king comes to e7 so that he's ganging up on the d7 pawn, and Magnus is a pawn up now. And he takes and proposes a rook swap, and the rooks are swapped off, and the bishop king comes to c3, the king comes to d6. He's heading here, and this is to cut him off from c6, and he goes to c5, threatening to come and win this pawn. So he goes to d3, and the king comes to d5, where he is in range to come either here or here. And the knight comes to f3, and the bishop comes to d8, and the pawn comes to g3, h3 to defend the g5 pawn, and the pawn comes to h6 to getting ready to push, and the pawn comes to h5. And this push, h5 by Carlsen, ensures that this pawn is permanently on a dark square, where it has to be defended by a piece and where it can be attacked by this bishop on e8. And they swap pawns, and he comes to c3, e3, and Carlsen comes to c5. Comes to d3, and Carlsen comes to b4, and Yakovenko resigns. Why does he resign? He's just a pawn down. Because if he moves the knight, the pawn can be taken. If he doesn't move the king, then he can move the knight here and here or here and protect this pawn, but then this pawn falls. So he can move the king here and protect this pawn, but then Magnus will move his pawn to here, and then he will have no moves soon where he can defend everything. He could come here with his king, then Magnus will come here with his bishop, taking away this square, and yeah, eventually, he comes here, Magnus comes here, he could come here with the king, Magnus says check here, the king has to come back, and it has no more squares to defend the pawn, and then if the knight moves, this pawn falls, and then we've got passed pawns on both sides, something knights are particularly bad at stopping. It's amazing how dominating a position that bishop is in way back there on d8. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that we have come to expect from Magnus. Maybe not so much in 2009. In 2009, this kind of masterful endgame win was not so common for Carlsen. He was a bit of a tactical player when he was younger, and this is kind of Magnus maybe showing, oh, actually, I'm a bit maturer now. I can play a nice mature opening like the Najdorf and find my way to an advantageous endgame and win that endgame. And that's exactly what he done. So, yeah. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.